afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to RUSI today. My name is Isabella Chase, and I'm a research analyst here at the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies. And I'll be your chair today for this panel discussion on the Financial Action Task Force Strategic Review. So earlier this year, it was announced that from 2020, the Financial Action Task Force will have an open-ended mandate. This recognised its 30 years of sustained public and political commitment to fighting money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation finance. Its 40 recommendations provide a framework that, in theory, tightens the net around actors who seek to profit from crime. Its mutual evaluation reports offer a detailed insight into a country's laws, regulations, and institutions, which allow us all to better understand not only a country's ability to combat economic crime, but its effectiveness in doing so. Its triannual plenaries and increasing number of working groups, such as those into RegTech and supervision, offer policymakers the opportunity to come together to exchange thoughts and ideas in a truly unique setting. And through its network of FATF-style regional bodies, the group can achieve a truly global reach of its standards. But as we reflect upon the successes of the past 30 years and the organisation's new permanency, it's important to take this opportunity, as FATF itself has done, to recognise where there may be areas for improvement. After all, the landscape in which this body must now exist and contain risk looks drastically different to how it once did. Large banks are now joined by fintechs and innovative payment providers, and money is no longer just fiat, but also virtual and digital. With this comes a shift in consumer expectations, who now expect faster services, narrowing the amount of time for traditional compliance checks. Growing concerns around data privacy must be balanced with an increased call for transparency of things, especially like ownership. And the nature of the threats that we face appear to morph at a rate that far exceeds that of the early noughties. And a number of recent scandals, often involving billions worth of dollars of illicit cash, highlight that we now perhaps need to look to a wider selection of gatekeepers to control the problem. It has been suggested by some that the FATF system is too slow to keep up with this pace of change, and perhaps potentially a little politicised to have the willingness to do so. Over the course of the next hour or so, we will consider these and a number of factors for which should be borne in mind for the FATF strategic review. To do so, I'm joined by an esteemed panel, which includes David Lewis, the Executive Secretary of the Financial Action Task Force, who will tell us more about the scope and the ambition of the review. We're joined by Richard Chalmers, an AML consultant and former co-chair of the FATF Evaluation and Compliance Group, who will take us through some of the lessons learned in the 2012 methodology change. We're also joined by Giles Thompson, the Deputy Director of the Sanctions and Illicit Finance team at HM Treasury, who will give us an idea of what the UK would like to see through the strategic review. We're also joined by Dr. Jackie Harvey, the Professor of Financial Management and Director of Business Research at Newcastle Business School at Northumbria University, who will share with us what the current evidence base can tell us about what the system requires. And finally, we're joined by Matthew Redhead, a RUSI Associate Fellow and author of a recent paper entitled Deep Impact, refocusing the anti-money laundering model on evidence and outcomes. So each of our panelists will speak for roughly 7 minutes, and then we'll give David the opportunity to respond to what he's heard from his fellow panelists. We will then open the floor to questions. To remind you all, this event is under the RUSI rule, which means that all the comments you hear now, which are prepared, are on the record, but any comments made in the Q&A will be off the record. So, to begin, we hand to David, the Executive Secretary of the Financial Action Task Force, to tell us more about your plans for the strategic review.
Thanks, Isabella. Before I start, I should say that Richard's to blame for pretty much everything to do with FATF in the last 20 years. And Giles is actually the head of the UK delegation to the FATF. So I think only Jackie and Matthew are the independent people on the panel tonight. I should also say hi to Mike. Mike's just flown back overnight from the US, where he collected the American Society of Criminology Lifetime White Collar Crime Prize. So, I'm delighted you could make it. So thanks, Tom, for holding this event, and Isabella for chairing this panel. I'll provide the context for the review and then set out how it will work and what it will involve. The FATF has held substantive reviews between the previous 2 rounds of mutual evaluations. They've involved wholesale reviews of the FATF standards, and last time also included the introduction of the methodology for assessing the effectiveness of national AML CFT measures. In so doing, the FATF became the first global standard setter to assess not only the existence of laws, regulations, and institutions, etc., so-called technical compliance, but also to attempt to assess the use of those measures and the impact of them. The FATF is now about 2/3 of the way through the current round of evaluations. There are still 10 or so member countries to be evaluated, and we do about 6 a year. So we already have a substantive body of evidence, both on how countries are doing and on what is working well and not so well in terms of the way FATF evaluates countries. There are some positive results. However, most countries are failing when it comes to effectiveness, and still many are failing on technical compliance. For example, 75% of countries need to make fundamental or major improvements to their supervision of financial institutions and other regulated businesses, and 100% of countries need to make fundamental or major improvements to the implementation of preventative measures by financial institutions and other regulated businesses. This is the context of the Chinese Presidency of the FATF making a strategic review the first priority of its term. The challenge today is not the absence of standards. They are regularly updated to keep pace with new and emerging risks. For example, this year the FATF introduced the first global standards in any area for virtual assets, including so-called cryptocurrencies and now stable coins. The challenge today is effective implementation of the FATF standards. Our evaluation of effectiveness by countries shows a focus on processes more than outcomes, and that the implementation of a risk-based approach by most countries remains in its infancy. Hence, the focus of the strategic review is on how FATF evaluations of countries can better promote and enable more effective and efficient AML CFT measures. It will consist of a stocktake, then work to review and modernize the mutual evaluation and follow-up processes, including the work of FATF's International Cooperation and Review Group that leads to the so-called grey and blacklists. The FATF requires governments, supervisors, financial institutions and other regulated businesses to take a risk-based approach. But the FATF doesn't take a risk-based approach itself. It takes 10 years to carry out a mutual evaluation of all FATF member governments. The evaluation process is very effective in motivating countries to take action. However, the motivation is generally to avoid a bad report, and the consequences of that, including potential naming and shaming by the FATF in grey and blacklists, as this increases the cost of doing business in those countries and deters foreign direct investment, as well as affecting their international reputation. The action is rarely motivated by reducing harm to societies and citizens by following the money that fuels crime and terrorism, or by protecting the integrity of the financial system or promoting financial inclusion. As such, while FATF evaluations motivate meaningful actions that does have an impact, the way in which it does so does not encourage a level playing field or real focus on crime and terrorism. Through the FATF evaluations of effectiveness, we see countries taking a tick box approach to regulatory compliance and focusing on processes rather than outcomes. This needs to change. The evaluations motivate action, but they also suck up resources that would or should otherwise be focused on tackling money laundering and terrorist financing. All of this flows through to the follow-up and ICRG processes. The grey and blacklists are very effective, but they are largely the result of the mutual evaluation process and schedule, and as such, at any point in time, the list does not represent all the greatest geographic risks of the day. Also in 2013, the FATF introduced a review of effectiveness for countries to take place 5 years after their mutual evaluation. It had been planned to pause these reviews after the first 6 in order to check if they are delivering what is expected. However, last month the FATF decided to do this now, after the first 2 of Norway and Spain, so that the results of that can be taken into account by the strategic review. This happened because we identified areas which we already know we can improve about that process. So, in conclusion, the strategic review will look at whether there should be a fifth round of evaluations immediately after this one. If there should be, how should countries be selected and their evaluations scoped? Are there ways in which FATF evaluations can better encourage effective implementation of the standards? Can the methodology be enhanced and changes made to encourage countries to more effectively combat money laundering and terrorist financing? Should evaluations treat all countries identically, regardless of risk and of the capacity of countries to implement the standards? And how can the FATF Global Network, that is the 9 FATF-style regional bodies, the IMF and the World Bank, how can they improve the quality and consistency of their evaluations? There is, I should say, qualified interest from FATF member governments to hear from the private sector, academia and think tanks such as RUSI as part of this review, and there will be opportunities for this. In the meantime, events such as this are very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Now on to Richard. You helped to review the methodology in 2012. What lessons can you give us from that experience?
Thank you, Isabella. Well, David, as always, has sort of usurped some of my comments, but I can reinforce some of them, but maybe take forward a couple of them. The impetus for the revision to the process in 2013, the new methodology, was really driven by, I guess, four main concerns, which had been voiced often by some people in this very room now. I guess the first of those was there's no evidence within the process that it's really making a difference to criminal acts, to the proceeds of crime being generated. That was a major concern. There was also concern that the third round process was a one-size-fits-all one, where basically everybody was being given exactly the same process, irrespective of scale, risk, magnitude of activity, etc. The focus was purely on technical compliance, and although there were some attempts at effectiveness, these were very rudimentary, and there was no sort of standard way of trying to approach it. And this was partly the result of a lack of any meaningful data that jurisdictions were generating, which could give assessors any sense as to where they might focus their work. And equally, I mean, there was concern about the quality of some of the assessors, that often they were considered not to be up to the job. I know there were some jurisdictions which used the assessment process as a training exercise for their staff, whereby you come in 2 months ago, you need to get up to speed on your knowledge of the FATF, so go on a mutual evaluation. It's the quickest way to learn, but of course that's not the role of the assessors. So there are a number of principles that led into the fourth round and the construction of the methodology in 2013. I guess the most fundamental of those was focus on risk. Look to a much more risk-based approach to the assessments, whilst at the same time looking at technical compliance as presenting the necessary building blocks for a framework, but moving beyond that to look at what outcomes were being achieved, and these were the now famous or perhaps infamous 11 immediate outcomes which are assessed against. Also, there's a desire to produce better targeted recommendations. The old reports in the third round could have 100 recommendations buried in the text, but no one had any idea where the material recommendations were and what the sort of priority was for implementation. What were the quick wins and what were the strategically important recommendations. Also, an attempt was made to train assessors to require assessors to go through a training process ahead of doing the mutual evaluations, and I'd be interested to hear from David how that's progressed as things have evolved. So what are my sense of the continuing issues? And I'm now on the other side of the fence, as it were, because I'm advising some jurisdictions on how to go about the mutual evaluation process. I think that the current process is a distinct improvement on the previous round, but I'm still far from convinced that the reports are really picking up on effectiveness. It does seem to me, I think as David indicated, it's a different form of box ticking that's emerged now, is that people are using the effectiveness methodology not as a sort of basic framework for strategic thinking on how effectiveness can be achieved, but really looking through the examples and ticking off whether countries have got the right data or not, irrespective of what that data is actually being used for. So I'm really not convinced that they're genuinely risk-based now. And I think that the major failing remains this issue about this. What are we actually achieving? Is there any benefit throughout this very expensive process? Is there any evidence that proceeds of crime are being reduced in some way? And that's one of the, I think, the fundamental faults. If you read the reports, you will not see any commentary whatsoever on that particular issue within the reports. So what I would like to see, I think, is much more focus on genuine risk, and not risk within a jurisdiction, but global risk. What are the jurisdictions that present the most risk to the international system, and focusing future evaluations very much more on that aspect, rather than going through this process of evaluating 200 and whatever it is jurisdictions around the world, irrespective of how important they are for the framework. And I think also that we need to do a process which is much more sort of cold calling type in assessments. At the moment, we have an 18-month lead-in period, which is extremely expensive process for everybody in terms of preparation, going through all the training mechanisms, all the consultancy work that now goes on. And my concern is that it's become much more a question of how do we pass this exam, rather than are we actually committed to the principles because they are sound principles to commit to. For instance, if you look at jurisdictions, many jurisdictions that during the third round did not very well. They were then put into a follow-up process. They passed new laws, etc. They got off the grey list if they were on it. And then they have stood still because, sigh of relief, we're off the frame, out of the framework, we can sit back and do nothing. And now suddenly, 10 years later, they're all panicking that they've got to catch up again. And I've got really no sense that at the end of this round, we're not going to fall back into the same situation, that they will say, well, we've got 10 years breathing space now, we can sit back. So I think there really needs to be a process where we're much more focused on the individual, the real risks within the international system, and we go in and hit those jurisdictions on a more frequent basis with limited amount of forewarning to really see what's going on, and also not to worry about some of the jurisdictions which really pose no threat to the international system. I am concerned about the processes as well. I say this has become a real spawning ground for consultancy. I have to say, I'm not complaining personally, but I'm also very concerned about the quality of some of the consultancy and the sheer cost to jurisdictions of going through this process, and the cost to the FATF and the membership of the FATF. It is phenomenally expensive. I think one of the things that used to amuse me when we were doing the revision to the standards leading up to 2012 was that my co-chair and I would keep saying to the membership, you do realize what you're creating, don't you? That this, you said that for the fourth round you wanted a lighter touch, less resource-intensive result. And what you've created is a phenomenally resource-intensive, intrusive process. And it is much, much more expensive for everybody now. And I'm not sure that it's actually delivering value for money. That's the other issue. What is the cost benefit of all this process? No one really has any idea there. And say benchmark is it actually reducing the proceeds of crime in any way? And I don't think it is to any extent. Just on a final point, to highlight this issue about whether they are risk-based, I looked briefly yesterday at the 90 reports, the ratings of the 90 reports that have so far been published. On immediate outcome 1, which is understanding risk, a third of the countries got an acceptable rating on that, which implies that they have been applying proper resources to competent authorities and undertaking their work, and they really are focusing on risk. You then look at my area of focus, which is preventive measures. On IO3, which is a supervisory issue, you have only 2 authorities, 2 jurisdictions that got an acceptable rating for supervision of financial institutions. I think it was IO4. Sorry, no, for supervision is IO3.
Yeah, no, 25% did all right in IO3.
Is it,
It's 2 on IO4.
2 IO4. Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. 9 got us substantial for IO3 supervision. So of the 30 who got a good, reasonable rating for understanding their risks, actually very few of them were seen to implement that through their supervision. And then you look at the and getting a reasonable rating for supervision implies that you have been bringing about change within the financial institutions, because that's one of the key issues. But only 2 countries out of the whole lot have got a reasonable rating for implementation of preventive measures by financial institutions. And bizarrely, those 2 are Armenia and Albania, which is a very strange, yeah. So one does question, are these assessments looking at risk in the round? They're looking at risk individually components of the reports, but aren't actually looking at the whole process together. So I think that there's a number of issues there.
Okay. Thank you very much, Richard. So if the current round is like passing an exam, it's time to speak to the top of the class, the UK. Giles, your team led the recent UK mutual evaluation process, which ended up with the highest rating ever. Can you tell us about maybe a bit more about what you learned through conducting that and what the UK would like to see in the strategic review?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Yeah, and as Isabella said, so I spent 4 years leading the UK delegation to the FATF, including for the UK's mutual evaluation. So my comments are very much based on that experience, as well as I'll lean forward, as well as what the UK would want to get out of the strategic review going forward. So I think my starting point would be that although FATF is far from a perfect organisation and there's lots it could do better, and the strategic review is a good opportunity to try and start addressing that, I do also actually think that before we start doing all the stuff that FATF does badly and what we need to change, we also need to remind ourselves of what FATF has achieved and what it does well, so that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and end up unravelling some of the successes that FATF has had. So I just wanted to briefly set out what I think FATF has achieved and the areas that from a UK perspective we want to try and protect and preserve within the strategic review before offering a few thoughts on what we would like to change. So in terms of what FATF has achieved, so it's got one universal set of comprehensive standards for AML-CTF. Over 200 countries around the world have signed up to those. They're all peer-reviewed against those standards, and I think we've done almost 100 now under the current fourth round in about 5 years, so fairly substantial progress. And despite constant risks of the process becoming politicized, it does broadly remain a robust, comprehensive technical process. And they're not just kind of pretty standards, as David said, they're real consequences for countries if they fail to meet these standards, reputational, political, economic consequences. And you kind of see the strength of that really in FATF meetings, where there's a long line of finance ministers and central bank governors who are coming to meetings to argue their case, because they know if they end up on the grey list or the black list, it will have real consequences. So it does drive genuine and substantial change in countries, force them to make changes in order to secure better compliance. And I think all of that is all the more impressive when you bear in mind that the FATF itself is not underpinned by a legal treaty. The budget it operates on is pretty minuscule in comparison with most other international organisations, and the size of David's Secretariat is pretty small again in comparison with other organisations. So I think it's actually quite difficult to think of other international organisations that have achieved quite so much on relatively little resources. So first point, just to actually kind of start from the perspective of what FATF has managed to achieve before we start criticising and look for what more we need to do. Turning secondly to the strategic review and my comment about being careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, I think a few of the things that we're quite keen to preserve, or at least very cautious about changing. One is the principle of equal treatment, i.e. that each country gets subjected to a broadly comparable review process to their peers. I think there's a very valid argument that Richard mentioned, that countries with huge global importance to the financial markets like the UK, the US and others should perhaps be reviewed more regularly or more thoroughly. There's an argument that already happens to some extent in that the current evaluations are supposed to take the country's risk context into consideration. So, certainly say for the UK on something like IO3 and supervision, I felt at least that we were held to quite a high bar, quite rightly for that, because of the global significance of UK banks. And we came in for quite a lot of criticism of the quality of supervision of what FATF calls the DNFBB sector in the UK, lawyers and accountants. Again, quite rightly, because there's a huge professional services industry in the UK. Yet a number of other FATF countries have secured better ratings for that IO, despite the fact they don't regulate DNFBBs at all. So, I think that is actually, although, the UK report has been the subject of some criticism, is an example where FATF actually held our feet to the fire perhaps more than other countries because of the risk context of the UK. And actually, interestingly, when I talk to my peers in smaller countries, who you might expect to welcome the idea of moving off kind of equal treatment for everyone so they might have a lighter touch review process, they're actually more nervous of that than the larger countries. They see FATF reports as quite a valuable tool in enabling them to get positive endorsement of what they're doing, to market confidence. It's a good news story for them if they can revise their ratings upwards. So they're quite wary of actually moving away themselves from that principle. The second thing I'd be a little bit cautious about rushing to change is the principle of peer review in terms of who does the assessments. So I think some people, including Tom here at RUSI, have suggested that we should move to having a kind of international cadre of experts who do these assessments rather than assessors from countries. I'd be a little bit wary of that. I think there are issues with the quality and consistency of the reports, but I'd be wary for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's not clear to me you would actually get better results from farming these out to kind of independent assessors. You can look at some FATF assessments are actually done by international organisations rather than by countries themselves, and perhaps a little bit controversially, I'm not clear to me those reports are of a higher quality than other ones produced by the FATF network. And I think also moving away from the fact that as a country you are reviewed by your peers, by your colleagues, would risk losing some of the legitimacy of the process in the eyes of the people undergoing it, some of the pressure for change. It's perhaps easier for me to sell, this is a group of my peers who has given the UK recommendations about why they need to change, rather than some faceless bureaucrats passing over the recommendations. It does actually have more value when you're given recommendations and criticisms by a jury of your peers, rather than it's sometimes quite easy for politicians and governments to deflect faceless international bureaucrats' criticisms in a different way. And I think actually assessors bringing their own practical experience of having to make a system work in the real world is really valuable, rather than perhaps a more theoretical system that you might otherwise get. I think the ICRG process, the kind of grey listing, blacklisting process, I would be very wary about wholesale change of that. I think it's doing a broadly good job of trying to force change on countries with serious problems across the breadth of their AML-CTF system. I think something we might want to look at, though, is there are countries who may not have systemic failings across the breadth of their systems, but they have got some very major problems in one or two particular areas. They're not falling into the ICRG process, and is FATF failing to exert enough pressure on them? So to pick up the theme of my earlier comment around DNFPB supervision, for example, there were a number of fairly large countries in the FATF network who don't regulate all or some important DNFPB sectors and show no signs of doing so. And it's not clear to me that FATF has actually got a real hook to try and force them to do it. They're not in the ICRG process. Will they actually do it in a timely fashion? And then on the standards and methodology, I would be cautious about, and actually members have ruled out a whole-scale revision to the standards themselves at this point. I think undoubtedly there are improvements that could be made, and we are making targeted improvements. Virtual assets have come into to the standards. We're talking about potential changes to the beneficial ownership standard. But I don't think now is the right time to do whole-scale change. Countries are still in the middle of being assessed under this set of methodology and standards. And as David said, a lot of countries are still struggling to get to grips with those. So foisting large-scale change now would not be the right thing, I think. Those are all the things that I would be a little bit cautious about rushing to get rid of. They're not perfect, but they provide a solid foundation. Some areas that from a UK perspective, though, we are keen to think about and see change in the review, picking up a large number of comments that Richard and David have made. Firstly, I think we would like to see more timely and risk-based evaluations of countries that are less resource intensive, both for the assessed country and the assessors doing the assessing. I mean, as others have said, the MER is 2 years in the making. It's massively expensive, massively resource intensive. So I was lucky. I had a team of 3 or 4 people in my part of the Treasury that were devoted to nothing other than doing the FATF evaluation for about 18 months. A lot of countries won't have the luxury of being able to deploy 3 or 4 people. And of course, I then called on, 30, 40 people from regulators, law enforcement, who were giving up substantial chunks of their time. So it takes a huge amount of time and resource intensive. Second thing, kind of more timely, every 8 to 10 years feels like too far a gap between assessments, and we need to do stuff that is a bit quicker and provides actually some of our customers, like the private sector who read our reports, with a more timely snapshot of how countries are doing and where the main risks lie. And I think, so those would be the broad things in terms of the ME process. We are also supportive of the idea that I think both David and Richard alluded to of FATF looking at doing horizontal or thematic assessments alongside its country assessments. So we did 2 or 3 years ago now, we did something called the Terrorist Financing Fact-Finding Initiative within FATF, which was on the wake of the Paris and Brussels attacks, done in about 6 months, looking at countries' technical compliance, whether they've criminalised TF adequately and so on. But it was done in about 6 months, and I forget the exact figures, David may know, but I think within about 3 or 6 months, 50 countries had changed their legislation to do with terrorist financing as a result. So I think it's easier to conceive of these in technical compliance when you can do a desk-based exercise comparing countries, less easy for effectiveness where the value of interviews and on-sites is much higher. But I do think that TFFI initiative is a really good example of a horizontal review that was timely in response to a risk and achieved real results. Thirdly, I would like to see FATF give more attention to supporting the global network and the FATF-style regional bodies, deliver what's required of them under the 4th round and then whatever the 5th round is. the results in the global network are lagging far behind those of the FATF countries. They're largely the countries with less capability and resource to devote to the process. And so the UK is actually has made a large voluntary contribution to the FATF Secretariat to help the Secretariat do more, to help regional bodies and countries increase its training offer, increase the support for secretariats. France has done likewise. The UK would like to see more countries do the same. And if you look at which countries actually support the global network amongst the FATF membership, it's probably about the same 10 countries who are the people attending meetings of the regional bodies, commenting on their reports, providing assessors. And from a UK perspective, we'd actually like to make it more of a direct, concrete obligation on each FATF member to do more to support standards across the whole global network. And finally, improving private sector engagement. So I think, as David mentioned, there's perhaps differing views on this, but I would very much endorse, I think, comments others have made that the FATF standards, they are in large part applied by the private sector for the preventative measures at least. They're a large driver of costs. I would like to enhance the dialogue we have with the private sector, both about the cost effectiveness of those measures in achieving the outcomes we want, and also ways in which they might be able to change in order to better reflect the realities of actually what people are doing on the ground. And I know there's some very interesting work that some people in the private sector in the UK and elsewhere are starting to do about how to measure effectiveness from a private sector perspective to feed into FATF evaluations that I'm very much encouraging FATF to try and listen to and adopt in its methodology. I'll stop there, but that's probably just my snapshot of the key things we want to change, but also the key things that we're wary of changing too much because of the success they've had to date.
Thank you, Giles. So moving on, Professor Jackie Harvey, you're a leading academic in this space. What does the available evidence base tell us about what needs to change?
Well, thank you, Isabella, for referring to me as being leading. I think I'd like that recorded.
And it is big.
Thank you. And I'm leaning forward because I realise I couldn't actually see Isabella at the point at which she goes like this at me, because as an academic, we tend to talk in 50-minute chunks. So 7 minutes is a bit of a challenge. So what I want to do is, I think I've got maybe about 6 I can't count. 6 points that I want to make. And I would start everything by context. So I would take you back to the background, the purpose, the why, how have we got to where we are today? Because I almost feel that sometimes that gets forgotten in the rush to expand and include more rules and regulations. So I would start by just reminding ourselves that the background for a lot of this really comes primarily from the United States, and with its particular focus at the time back in the 1980s, early 1990s, and this fixation that it still has about tax evasion. And at the time, the link very much to offshore finance centres. You take that and you put against it the Southeast Asian financial crisis that suddenly brought in concerns about integrity around the financial system, and the fact that contagion was an issue, and you're almost creating the conditions whereby the concern around drugs and the north-south movement and shipment of drugs created the rationale for the approach. And I've said this before in public forum, but it is worth focusing on those very first principles around what was FATF established to do. And it was a very it was almost an afterthought of the G7 meeting. It was very far down the agenda to set up a financial action task force that would look at issues to do with money laundering. And those first 40 recommendations, that first document, ran to 28 pages. And from that, we've now got, well, the 2012 version was 134 pages, and all of the associated guidance notes, rules, interpretations, etc. So we started with something that was very much purposed around one issue, which was around drugs. And it's been expanded to deal with all sorts of what my more esteemed colleague over here, Mike Levy, referred to in Cambridge as all sorts of social bads. And so it is therefore important that this approach should be subject to critical examination. We should always be looking at ways to improve. And the fact that the framework has embraced 200 countries, it should be hoped that whatever is being proposed is transparent and safeguards the basic means of democratic control and rules of law. We shouldn't be assuming that everything that was designed for one set of problems and for one set of countries is appropriate for every other one, without consideration for that country's culture and legal basis. So I applaud RUSI for calling for transparency, and apologies, but I've never seen that as part of the genetic makeup of FATF, so it's unlikely that it's going to change now. That's my background. Just to get onto my points, there is a problem around statistics and numbers. We have, and FATF has focused, recommendation 33 is very clear about how you're going to measure efficiency. It's very clear also that it proves very challenging for a lot of countries. What I find quite entertaining, though, is that there is less degree of concern around the large numbers that are bandied around about the scale of threat. And Richard, you did ask about cost-benefit analysis, and a number of academics, myself included, have tried to look at cost benefits. It's just about impossible because the costs accrue over here, and the British government, give them their due with their regulatory impact assessments, have done those. But the benefit is always the benefit to society, which is intangible. You can't deny it, but you can't measure it. And the costs, it's very hard to get. The costs are large, but often banks don't want to share how much it's costing. So the other side of that is that effective and efficient are two words that are used interchangeably. And I would counsel that effective is as an adjective that focuses on successful in achieving its desired result. Efficient is achieving that result with minimum wasted effort or expense. Can we please move from focusing on effective and focusing on what we can achieve that is efficient, and recognize that in line with good principles of legal frameworks and regulation is that you do the least possible intervention to achieve the desired outcome. So I would note that a clear set of principles has become very, very complicated, and so that by the time you're at the coalface, it is very difficult. There is a constant going back up the chain to ask for more guidance, and there is a lot more. So the risk-based approach is a very challenging one to operationalize, simply because of if you are, and we've seen this in some work that we've done when we've looked at mutual evaluations, if you determine something to be low risk, you're far more likely to be challenged by an assessment team than if you determine it to be high risk. So the risk-based approach is more a risk-averse approach. So for whose benefit is that? I would argue that maybe can we begin to think that less could be more? What we see is that each problem that occurs and each bank that is uncovered for transgressing or for allowing its own rules to be broken. There is an assumption that everything has to be ramped up again and tightened. And I would argue that that isn't necessarily the right way to achieve the best outcome. So less may be more. I know there's a lot of sunk cost. I know there's a lot of vested interest. Richard actually talked about the AML industry. It keeps a few of us academics busy as well. So I've already said about the importance of paying attention to different cultural values and rules of law. We've been running a project in Nigeria looking at beneficial ownership. And I think it's really interesting that we take a set of recommendations. I've already said about the fact that they were designed for one purpose and for one group of countries, and try and apply them to a different culture and country. And it is really interesting that in Nigeria, 60% of the population don't have a bank account. So trying to roll out something through the banking sector is pretty tricky. And record keeping is manual in a lot of cases. So it's really hard to get any statistics at all, and certainly any that you can understand or are useful. So, how am I doing? 1 more minute, great. So, if we were to be thinking about what is a better approach and what might be efficient and proportionate, let's recognize that whatever we do, both sides have to recognize the fact that if we can minimize the burden and the cost, it might be a better system, and that in order to achieve that degree of manageability, we may have to give up some potential intelligence that flows through the system. So I would advocate a more pragmatic approach. That's how I do all my research, highly pragmatic. And finish with the point that I would argue is that let's get back to focusing on where it's important, which is about, I think others have also said about, if we aren't actually reducing the predicate offences because money laundering itself was what it was all bought in for. So we should really be focusing on prevention on the one side and asset recovery on the other. And if no crimes are prevented and no assets are taken from criminals, one might as well have done nothing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie. So finally, Matthew, you've recently published a paper with us entitled Deep Impact, Refocusing the Money Laundering Model on Evidence and Outcomes. You interviewed an awful lot of private sector actors as part of this research. We've heard already tonight a couple of things we think the private sector might want to see from this strategic review, but do you have any other insights of what you would expect that sector to require?
Well, the first thing I'll say is never go last on a panel. Because most of what's been said already I would reflect and agree upon. In terms of the private sector, I mean, I noticed on the advert for this, it said, there'll be experts, there'll be people from FATF and involved in FATF, there'll be academics, critics. I'm assuming that I'm meant to be the critic here. I think we have to be honest about the level of scepticism that there is in some places, particularly in the private sector, in the obligated entities, primarily financial services, but not just financial services, about the reality of what these standards actually do. Because the reality is, for most of us who've been working in this sector, it's a lot of money, a lot of man hours, and we're beginning to ask ourselves the question, what is the result of all this? Now, obviously we take the view that we have to fight crime, therefore we should do it. But I think a point that Jackie made is very, very important here, which is about proportionality and necessity, and making sure that the measures that we actually apply, we know, where we've got reasonable evidence that they work. So what we've done with FATF recommendations over the years is build an incredible structure. The house that FATF built, which has got bigger and bigger and bigger and more sophisticated. And more sectors are involved in that, which is great, and all the rest of it. But the focus has become on the structure itself rather than what's actually happening on the ground. So, you know, Jackie mentioned the point about confiscation and all the rest of it. If we look at the Europol report from 2016, I think they said that 2.2% of what they think are the proceeds of crime in the EU are frozen or provisionally, sorry, I'll get that right, provisionally, seized or provisionally frozen. And about 1.1% are confiscated. When we talk about costs and benefits, one has to actually look at that in that context and say, is it worth it? Now, I'm not saying it isn't worth it. And I'm not saying that the rules and recommendations and what have you don't work. But we don't know why they should work or how they should work or how well they work. We don't know in what context certain parts work better than others. And from the context of a private sector person, if I was advising a fintech now, I pretty much have to advise them to do most of the things that HSBC would be doing, within reason. Not because, obviously we talk about risk-based analysis, and that's good. The risk-based approach is a good thing. But the reality of that is there is an insurance mentality that goes with this, which says we talk about at a national level, wanting to pass the exam. That reflects all the way downwards to the micro level, to the institutions as well. It becomes about passing the exam. And I would like us to sort of refocus a little bit and take a step back, as Jackie said, and ask ourselves what is the first principle in all of this. We look at the objective that FATF has, and I think it says protecting the financial system from money laundering and CTF, which sounds very noble. And I understand what Jackie says about how difficult it is with data. But there is a part of me that thinks we need to start think more about this. We need to invest more time, sponsor more research. Yes, the data isn't good now, but we've got to start somewhere. And I think it's really incumbent upon FATF not to stop doing what it's doing, but to provide a justification and the evidence to show that why it's doing what it's doing matters and works. Because otherwise there will be a credibility gap for FATF in its next 30 years. So if you were to say, I have one point really, which is evidence, if we can start collecting it. And I think that's the critical thing, because we need, if FATF is going to continue to do its good work, we need to ensure that the institutions that are required to do the heavy lifting have faith in that framework too. And there's one little bit extra to that, which is innovation. So FATF is supporting innovation. I think it's supporting innovation in the private sector. But I would say, look beyond innovation in terms of just applying the standards. Start asking questions about whether there are different ways of doing this, whether it has to be done by obligated entities in the private sector, whether there can be greater partnerships, which we're already looking at, between the public and private sector in terms of detection and prevention, rather than obligating sectors and putting more and more cost on them. Because the reality is financial crime is interconnected and global, and each institution is looking at it in a divided way. So there must be other ways that we can look at this. And so if we're going to look at the evidence for the system, I would humbly ask that FATF also start looking at evidence for alternative ways of doing what needs to be done. So I basically went completely off script there. To sum up, I would say the last 30 years has been the age of standards. I think the next 30 years needs to be the age of evidence.
Nice. Thank you very much, Matthew. So, So before we open the floor to questions, we're going to give David 5 minutes so that he can respond, very tightly enforced 5 minutes, to respond to what we've heard so far. We've heard from our panelists questions around what do these standards actually do, and do we have any, sorry, not in that way, and what evidence do we have to support their success? What is the cost benefit of implementing them? Should we treat all countries the same? Should we look at standardizing assessors? Why is there such a difficulty in implementing the risk-based approach? And overall, does this really have any impact on predicate offences and global risk? So, David, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Isabella. Well, I mean, I have to say that there's nothing I disagree with that's been raised on the panel this evening. That said, I'll try and defend FATF for a moment. I'm FATF's biggest critic most of the time. But Giles started off quite well with, let's be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I thought Matthew ended up with a very concise statement, which was entirely right. The last 30 years has been about standards. The next 30 years needs to be about evidence and effective impact. And I think we're heading in the right direction, but we have a long way to go, and we're not even halfway there yet, wherever there is. Richard asked about training of assessors. This is a huge issue. Lots of countries send their new staff to us to be trained as assessors, whereas what they actually want them to be trained on is the FATF standards and what AML is. That's a huge challenge. There are some assessors in the room, though. There's Yehuda at the back. There's probably only maybe 10 or 20 assessors worldwide who are really, really good. Richard's probably the best one. Yehuda is here. Who else? Jeremy, I think, is over here somewhere. Oh, he's left in the UK. Ruth, I thought Ruth was in South Africa with the IMF doing their assessment. So there are some good assessors, but considering the number of countries that are now being assessed, 200, and it's not just every 10 years. We have follow-up assessments. We have now this fifth year review of effectiveness. We need a lot more assessors, and so we need to find a solution to that. We need quality assessors, and I don't know what the answer is there. The suggestion for more timely reports, but also more cold calling, I think is a really good one. At the moment, it is the countries that have the best reports, due respect to Giles, the ones that have prepared the best for the evaluation. You know, we publish our methodology. The questions are all there. You just need to read it. But if you spend enough time collecting the data and developing a narrative, then you can get a reasonable result. So I think that's worth focusing on. We have created an industry of consultants, and that I hate that personally. I'm not sure that's effective. I think a lot of that has come from a mixed bag of supervisory practice, and the fines on the banks is an interesting one. So we talked about the costs, and I read a paper by Denise Ruddick recently, 85 billion last year spent on compliance by financial institutions just in Europe, 23 billion in Asia. There's a lot of money being spent. However, that money is more a function of the size and complexity of those financial institutions, I think, than of the requirements on them by FATF passed down through national regulators. You know, HSBC is no small institution. It's bigger than many countries in the world. So if you choose to operate a business of that size, your costs for compliance are going to be big. Add on top of that that they weren't doing anything for many years and they're playing catch up, means that costs are probably higher now than they would have been if they'd been complying all along. So I don't think that the costs are necessarily a factor of inefficient standards. That said, there is efficiency is very different to effectiveness. We have a problem with both right now. We don't have enough effectiveness. We don't have a way of measuring effectiveness. You can't really talk about the available proceeds of crime in a country and how much of that has been seized. And when it comes to efficiency, what we have at the moment is definitely not efficient. completely recognise Jackie's point about let's look at how we can minimise costs. Sadly, I'm not sure we'll get there. FATF's great, but FATF is a task force of countries. It's not me and my team in Paris. It's now 39 countries and representatives of 9 FATF-style regional bodies, plus the IMF and the World Bank and the UN. They all have a say. And we don't get agreement on standards or changes to the methodology without agreement by all 39 countries, without on all those other people having a say as well. So I'll push back slightly on Jackie's point about the sort of transparency and democratic nature of the process. I understand if you're not in FATF, you feel excluded. However, from sitting inside of FATF, it seems to me that there are more people in it than out of it. That every agency from 200 jurisdictions are entitled to be in the room. And every report done by the FATF or regional bodies is sent round to 200 countries, and they all have an opportunity to have their say. Most of them don't, to be frank. They don't look at it, but the opportunity is there. So I think it is quite transparent. That says there's lots more to do. Cost-benefit analysis. Keith is in the audience. I started doing domestic anti-money laundering with Keith back in 2000 and something, and we did a cost-benefit analysis, but industry wouldn't let us publish it. So we came up with a balance that was pretty good in the end. It was before all the big bank fines and these billions that are being spent. But you can look at it from a society benefit, and there are some qualitative ways of doing that. But it's always going to be contentious. And we could get lost in trying to quantify the benefits to the point that we just get tired. We would tie ourselves up in knots. I personally think that every successful investigation, everyone put behind bars, is a success. We're never going to win the fight against money laundering, because while there is crime, there will be money laundering. And you don't say to the police, well, you may as well go home because you're just finding more crime, aren't you? And it's kind of the same here. So I think we have to notch up our successes, which today most countries have criminalized money laundering, criminalized terrorist financing. There are thousands of successful investigations and prosecutions in countries all around the world. Whatever the dent is on the overall impact, that's activity that wouldn't be happening if it wasn't for FATF. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Great. And on that positive note, it's time to open to questions.